Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're doing a series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess. I think this is like number 184 or something like that. So hopefully you've been enjoying the series. If you haven't told your friends about it, that's the best thing you can do. Tell your friends. You can also like the videos and subscribe to the channel. I thought I'd talk a little bit today about perceived versus actual problems. When I get a new student, I always ask them something like, what do you want to get out of lessons? What are your perceived weaknesses and so on? And a lot of times what they perceive as their weaknesses, even though it's related to their weaknesses, is not exactly their weakness. So I thought I'd go through some of the examples. Like, for instance, when people say, I'm not very good at the end game. Well, that's going to be true, but what they really have problems with is analyzing. They hand-wave positions. Hand-waving is where you just move on general principles instead of actually trying to figure things out. So if they studied a bunch of endgames like Lucena or Philidor or all those kind of things, it wouldn't make them a lot better because they're not analyzing the position. Another problem that they perceive to have, is lack of knowledge of the openings. But when I go over the games, they're just not following opening principles and they're not checking to see if their moves are safe. And of course that gets back to analysis as well. I thought just for the fun of it, I'd pick out a kind of a random endgame that I had in my library. And we could go over, what someone might do if they're not very good. And maybe I can try to play it against Stockfish and see if I can win this game. So white has an extra pawn. Some people call this the outside passed pawn. I don't call this the outside passed pawn. If you watched one of my earlier videos on, rook pawn tactics in the endgame, I always said when you have the outside passed pawn, it's when both sides have passed pawns, and yours is on the outside of the rest of the pawns, then that king has to go further away to get the pawn, and the white king is going to be closer to this pawn, and that gives white the big advantage in this endgame. But if black doesn't have this pawn at all, like we started with, you could call this an outside passed pawn, but it's really the passed pawn. It's not. It's outside of the other pawns as well, but there's no pawn to compare it to where it's more outside. So again, it's a matter of semantics. I've seen people call this the outside passed pawn. So suppose you're going to use this pawn to deflect the king and try to win. Well, if you're a beginner and you just think, oh, well, he has to go get that pawn, I'll make him go get it. Let's say you just start pushing that pawn. And then you keep pushing and he goes here. And now you say, okay, his king's over there, I'll start bringing my king up. And you try to bring your king up and he gets his king back, and all of a sudden you can't get in. And, you said, gee, I was told if I had the outside passed pawn, I should use it as a deflection. And, I did, and I wasn't able to win the game. All right, so let me try playing this against Stockfish and see what happens. I would say before you want to push this pawn, as much as you can, you want to get your pawns advanced and maybe fixed his pawns to make them a target. So I'm going to play f4 check. And if black plays his king this way, I'm not going to push this pawn maybe further than b3. I'm just going to try to get my king up to e5 and behind his pawns while he's doing that. If he plays his king toward the king side, then I'll fix the pawns first and then eventually push the b pawn and deflect him. All right, Stockfish, what do you want to play here? Stockfish says king d5. Okay. So now I could play g4. I could play king d3. If I play king d3 and he plays f5, that's exactly what I want. Now the pawns are getting fixed. So let's do that. We'll play king d3. So I'm using a combination of knowledge here and analysis. If he pushes his pawns on the king side, I'll be able to block them. And if he moves his king over to c5, I'll be able to get my king up this way without having to push the pawn. So let's play king d3. Stockfish, what do you want to play? King e6. All right, king e6. In that case, I will play king e4. Again, the idea is to wait to push this pawn on the b file until I either get these pawns fixed or I can get my king up further. All right, Stockfish, what do you want to play here? King d6. Okay, at this point I could probably start to play g4. So let's do that, g4. Black says f6. All right, now I don't have to worry about his king coming in to f5 here. So I'm going to play king to d4. And at some point, I can get my king up toward d5 once his king gets to the b file. That's one way to do it. I could also play king f5 here, but then he plays king e7. Then I could push the b pawn, and that's probably winning too. Let's play king d4. King d4. Okay, Stockfish, what do you want to play for black? King c6. All right, so I could play h4, h5 here while I'm waiting. Again, trying to fix the pawns, getting my pawns closer to queening. h4. And, well, he's going back and forth between g6 and king d6. We'll let him think a little further. Looks like king d7, king d6. Let's play king d6. Okay. Fair enough. All right, so I can still keep on the same path with something like h5. Okay. And he's looking at g6 or f5. King e6, g6. Let's go g6. All right, so I want to keep the pawns on the board so I can get queens with them. Because when I push this pawn in and it gets deflected, then I want to have pawns over here to win. So I'm going to play h6. Okay, Stockfish says he'll play king e6. All right. So now the question is, do I want to start pushing the b pawn? Is it time? b4, king d6, b5. If he plays king c7, I play king d5. If he pushes a pawn, I can check him. b4, king d6, b5. If he plays king e6, I can play b6. If he plays king c7, I can play king d5. That should do it. All right, b4. And he's looking at king d6. All right, now we don't want to make the ABC error we talked about a video or two ago where we move b5 first. Let's recalculate. We had planned after b4, king d6, we would play b5. b5. If he plays king c7, I could probably win in multiple ways. If you watched my video, king and 5 pawns against king and 4, I'm sort of doing the same thing. So I could use the semi-stalemate method if I can run him out of pawn moves and make him sack a pawn. I don't think I can do this with this kind of pawn structure. I could push the b pawn and guard it and then wait till the last second to come over the king side, or I could just deflect them at once. So here I could play g5 to give me the e5 square. I could play g5. If he plays f5, I can play b5, and he's in Zugzwang. If I play g5 and he plays f takes g, he has to move. If he plays king c6, I play king e5 and I win. So I think both b5 and g5 win. Let's play g5. Stockfish says f takes g5. All right, I'll play f takes g5. Now he has to give way. Stockfish, what do you want to play? He wants to play king e6. All right, I will gladly play with the queen against 2 pawns because his pawns aren't even close to queening, or if he wants to run the other way. So I'll play b5. Stockfish isn't sure which one he wants to do. He says king d6 now. All right, I don't want to push the pawn quite yet. I will just wait. I'll bring my king closer with king e4. Now if king c5, king e5 wins, but what else could he do? If he plays king e6, I'll play b6. All right, he says king e6. I'll play b6. King d6. All right, so now I pretty much have to push the pawn one more time. I could wait and play king d4 and then king e5, but I think the tempos are about the same. b7. King c7. King e5. Now I don't want to push the pawn. That's a mistake. I talked about it in that video about rook pawns. King takes b7, king f6, king c6, king g7, king d6, king takes h7, king e5, play king takes g6, and it's mate in 9. I get a queen. All right, so why did we do this? Well, again, we're talking about what makes someone weaker in the endgame. All right, so if you have the knowledge that you have the outside pass pawn, or even if you don't call it the outside pass pawn, and you want to use it as a deflection, that's good knowledge. The question is, do you want to just push it down the board right away? Well, if you analyze that, like I showed you before, if you analyze that line where you just push the pawn, you're not getting enough tempos for your king to come in. And black gets back in time. So you really want to do what I did first, which is, get your kingside pawns rolling, make him move some of his kingside pawns, get your pawns closer to queening, and only make sure that his king goes over here once you can do something, and you don't want to push this pawn too far. For instance, every time once he goes after that pawn, every time you push it, you lose a tempo because he was going to get it anyway, and that's a tempo you could have used to bring your king around. So you don't want to do that. Let's go back to openings, and people say, I don't know enough about openings. All right, so let's go to an opening, and let's say, they say, well, I don't know very much about the French defense. So they're e4, e6, d4, d5, and they say, well, he's attacking my pawn. I will push it to get space. All right, well, you are getting a little bit of space here. And now black plays his break move. And suppose you don't know anything about the pawn structure and you're just guessing. You say, well, I'll develop my pieces. You could play knight f3. Then black would probably take the pawn. There is a line that Nimzovich had where he was doing stuff like this, but the computer doesn't think that much of it. And of course, it hasn't been played a lot by grandmasters. And now if you play knight takes pawn, your e-pawn becomes kind of weak. Knight c6, and you have to guard the pawn. You could play f4. But already your center is kind of falling apart a little bit. So if you play over lots of annotated master games, then you see when they play the French and black plays c5, they always play c3 to keep the pawn chain intact. So do you need that by memorizing a lot of openings? Well, you could, but the general principle that you want to keep your pawn chain intact kind of makes sense. And there's a lot of general principles in the opening that are very helpful to having you play the opening. For instance, e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. Here, suppose black says, all right, I'll just keep developing, I'll play d6. That's not good because when white plays d5, that's an AWL move. And it not only attacks the knight, but the knight doesn't have any wonderful places to go. If he goes d4, he loses a pawn on a counting sequence. If he goes e5, white can temporarily double the pawns. Black can undouble them with e6 later. But this is a little bit ugly for black, and he's wasted these tempos of moving the knight a couple times, even though white moved his knight a couple times also. If black plays e6, it's even worse, because now when white plays here, white has the possibility of playing d6 in some lines. Pawn takes, knight e7, d6, knight c6, queen e2 check wins a piece. Because the only way black can get out of check is to put a piece on e7 and lose that piece. So allowing white to push that pawn to d5 is almost always going to be bad. So you want to use the idea that if someone pushes a center pawn and you could take it with a side pawn and they can't take back with a pawn, then it's pretty much always going to be right to do that. It's going to be right to play pawn takes, knight takes. So what did I just say? I said if he can't take back with a pawn. Let's say white plays c3 instead. Now what black should do is counterattack the pawn on e5. He should play a move like d5 or knight f6. Those are the main lines because white can't guard it with a knight. But if he plays passively and he plays d6 and white plays d4, now if you take with the c-pawn, it looks like on the surface you're trading a side pawn for the center pawn. But that's not true because after you take with the side pawn to the center pawn, white takes with the side pawn to the center pawn and replaces his center pawn with another center pawn. And when black does that, he's not really gaining much. So when you make a move like c takes d, you have to do it on its own merits. You're not trading side pawns for center pawns. You're basically taking a pawn off your c5 square and taking a white pawn off the c3 square, which actually usually helps white because black's not going to put a piece on c5, but white's going to put a knight on c3. So notice how we did that. Black plays here. White plays here. Black gets the square now for his pieces because there's no pawn there. He also gets the white pawn not guarding b4 anymore, but there's no special things he can do on b4. But what happens here is that white can now develop his knight to the square because he made a concession on the second move of the game by playing c3 to take that square away from the knight. And when black decided to trade off, he gave that square back to the knight. Similar in the French, one of the questions that comes up in these advanced variation kind of pawn structures is, when does black take the d-pawn? Well, black doesn't take the d-pawn right away because the only square that really gives him is b4, and bishop to b4 check is not the most wonderful move. White can just play knight c3 and put his knight on the best square. I once had a student that said, why not trade off your bad bishop for his good bishop? And I said, well, there's a lot of squares on the king side that are dark that you can attack, and this bishop's a pretty good bishop. And my student happened to have been taking lessons with the grandmaster as well. And I said, ask the grandmaster about this. So he did. And next time I talked to him, I said, well, what did the grandmaster say? And he said, the grandmaster said, well, what you said about the good bishop and bad bishop is correct, but this is not the worst bishop I've ever seen. I would play knight c3. So the grandmaster agreed with me, and I think Stockfish, let's turn on Stockfish. Stockfish says, I agree with Dan and the grandmaster. Don't trade off your bad bishop for the good bishop. Just put your knight on c3 with a big advantage. Look at the size of the advantage that white has here. A normal opening advantage is like 0.2 or 0.3. Here, white's already up 1.2 or so. What did black do wrong? Well, it's really helpful when you have these strong engines to look at these things. Right here in this position, black, when you're in your book position, black's only down by a normal amount, like 0.2, 0.3. You know, it's jumping around, but around that level. And black's main move here is to play knight c6. Taking this pawn really helps white. Let's do it. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Now it jumps up to about 0.5, roughly. It's jumping around again, but it's higher than it was before. Before it was around 0.2, 0.3. Now it's around 0.4, 0.5. So black lost a couple tenths of a pawn by taking the pawn, and now this check, which looks like, oh boy, I can check him, I can get rid of his bishop. You know, when white gets to put the knight in the way, he's already up by more than a pawn. And more than a pawn, when Stockfish is playing itself, could be enough to win the game already if Stockfish plays both sides. So it's amazing, but black is close to a lost position already. If white had played bishop d2 instead, white's lead would only be about as big as it was before. Black could trade off that bishop and be down only about 4/10 of a pawn. But after knight c3, white's position is even better. You can learn a lot by going through the evaluations of the engines in your game. I always tell people, go through your game with your opponent first. Don't use the engine, just talk about the game, do your analysis, his analysis, pick his brain, learn from him, he learns from you. Then if you want, you can go home and give it to the engine and look at what the engine's saying. But you can learn a lot about, you know, what kind of ideas are good, what are bad. If you just want to do principles, there's a million things with principles. There's a book called Chess Rules of Thumb by Albert and Lawrence for, you know, adults learning principles. There's a book, The Wisest Things Ever Said About Chess by Andy Soldis. We can go to my website. Let me pull up my website here. Okay. So on my website, you can go under articles and blogs and go to principles. So there's principles. And I have them broken down to improving and learning principles, general and thought process principles, general other principles, opening principles, middle game principles, end game principles, and humorous principles. So if you want to learn about any opening principles, you can click on openings. This is all at danheisman.com. Starting out, I see the video on opening principles, which gives a link to my YouTube video. And I go to the top 10 opening principles. Number 1, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic, meaning a tactic for either side. Believe it or not, most lower-rated players absolutely cannot follow this guideline no matter how hard they try. They unfortunately have a better idea than to follow this long-lived advice. Yes, it takes people usually take quite a bit of time before they kind of learn how to do this. Number 2, it is usually much better to take a piece that is doing nothing and make it do something than it is to take a piece that's already doing something and make it do a little more. 3, develop the piece on the side you're going to castle before the pieces on the other side, or as a corollary, develop the bishop on the side you wish to castle before the other bishop. Number 4, don't develop your pieces to squares where they can just be efficiently attacked by enemy pieces of lesser value, AWL, often pawns, and therefore have to retreat. Castling is usually the most important move in any opening. It's the only move which may save a tempo by moving 2 pieces at once. I had several discussions with students this week about that because they were delaying castling, and they were delaying castling in dangerous positions where the center was open. For instance, if we're talking about the French defense, after e4, e6, d4, d5, e takes d, the e file is open with both kings on it. What should that tell you? It should tell you, get that king out of there as soon as possible. So good players play things like knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop d6, castle, castle, so there's no rook check. If you fool around a little bit, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, and now you decide to trade. Well, notice you've traded where your queen knight is out while black's king knight is out. And now if white waits even longer, and let's say since I'm going to do something like this, black can castle, and if white's not paying attention, all of a sudden black will check with the rook, and now white's got a problem. He has to move a piece twice here if he wants to castle, and waste more time, and already black is much better. So if you just don't follow those kind of opening principles, you can fall behind. All right, so we were talking about things that people think that they're not very good at when actually it's something else. We were talking about endgames. There's other reasons why people aren't good at endgames. If you're only playing a 10-minute game on the internet or 15-minute games, of course you're not going to be very good at endgames, because even if you're moving relatively quickly and you have a long endgame, you're not going to have really time to think about the moves. You're just going to have to move them on general principles or the first move you see, and you're not going to learn how to analyze. You're not going to learn how to figure out which positions mean what. You're just going to play it really fast, and you're probably not going to play it very well. So when you're playing those really short time control games, of course you're not going to be very good at the end game. So if you want to be a good player, it's okay to play some of those short time control games, but you should augment it by playing a bunch of long time control games also, where you really do get a chance to think. Another problem people have in the endgame is if they play too slowly in the opening and the middle game. They're so afraid of making a mistake that they make the bigger one of getting into unnecessary time trouble, and then they can never play good endgames. People who play too slow are usually bad at the endgames because they've used up almost all their time before they get to the endgame, and now they have to play the endgames quickly, and then things just fall all apart. So there's lots of reasons people are bad at the endgame other than not having endgame knowledge. It may be a lot of things other than not knowing Philidor or Lucena or king and pawn against king. It could be a lot of things we've talked about in today's video. So what are some other perceptions that people have on what they're not good at? Well, they say, we already said, they're not good at making safe moves. And the reason is they depend pretty much on, let me bring out my game with Steve here. They pretty much depend on just looking at whether a move looks safe. So here's a game where a 1500 was playing white, and he decides, wow, that e5 square is a good square for my knight. And not only that, but if he takes it with the knight, I can take back with the pawn and fork his 2 pieces. And he says, all right, I've got it guarded twice, it's attacked twice, it's safe. Well, that's a little bit of hand-waving, or you might call that inadequate analysis. When I looked at this position, I said, well, okay, you can't take with the knight. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, wins a piece. But what if he takes with the bishop? So white has 2 ways to take. If he takes with the pawn, black actually has 2 ways to try to win a pawn. He can play knight h5, trying to remove the guard on the bishop, and if the bishop goes here, black has all kinds of interesting moves. He can play d4 and undermine the guard on the bishop. He could try to remove the guard with g5. And black could also just play knight to g4 and hit this pawn twice, and white can never guard it again because of moves like queen takes e3 check. On the other hand, if black takes bishop takes e5 and white takes with the bishop, then simply knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight g4, and white has the same problem. He has no pieces on the board that can guard e5, and if he plays f4, again, knight takes e3, queen takes e3 check, wins at least a pawn, or if not more. So it turns out that white didn't really analyze knight e5 to see if it was safe. He just kind of looked at it and it looks safe. And one of the things I tell everybody is, when you're trying to determine if a move is safe, all those tactics that you've studied, all those patterns you recognize, if you use those patterns and you look for danger and you don't see it, that's a very good start to figuring out if your move is safe, but it's not sufficient. You also have to analyze the position. So here, if you look at knight e5 and you say, well, I don't know of any tactic that I've ever seen where, black would win material here, so I guess this is safe. That's okay in a speed game to think that way, but in a slow game, you actually have to go through the capturing sequences, the checks, captures, and threats. You want to use your pattern recognition to augment your analysis, not to replace it. So that's a typical problem people have, is they don't really pay attention to what the opponent can do. Once black starts to play bishop takes e5, then they start to realize, uh-oh, maybe he's got something. But then it's too late, because black's already spent the time trying to beat your move, and he's able to do it. You needed to spend time before you played knight e5 making sure that bishop takes e5 didn't work. If you don't do that, I call that hope chess. Why do I call it hope chess? Because if you make a move and don't look at your opponent's checks, captures, or threats, and then he makes a move like this capture, and then you start to realize I have no good way to recapture, you're just hoping that you can come out even here, that it's safe, and of course, as we just showed you, it's not. Okay, so, there's a lot of things that amateur players do wrong. You don't have to give up playing your fast games, but you do want to augment them with a bunch of slow games. You always want to play with an increment. Don't hit that 30-0 button and play with no increment. That's not a good way to do it. You want to schedule games with people that you meet on the internet, ask what time they like to play, set up a nice game with an increment, 45-45, 30-30. There's a million 45-45 leagues. Even if you don't want to join a 45-45 league, if you Google chess 45-45 and you find the 45-45 leagues at ICC or Lee Chess or wherever, the people who are on those leagues will play. If you are on those same servers, they'll play you slow games. Maybe not everyone will, but just talk with them. Join the clubs on chess.com, talk to people on the servers, and set up your own games and just schedule those games and play them with an increment, and that way you could play those slower games. Okay, lots of good advice today. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, again, please tell your friends about it. That's the best way to get the channel get going. Well, we've already hit 100,000 views, heading quickly to 110,000. I guess the next goal should be 1 million. Maybe we'll get a viral video someday. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.